So let's look at each one of those in succession. Okay, first, Pentecost was a Jewish feast. The word in Greek, Pentekoste, literally means the 50th. So it was the celebration of the 50th day after the offering of the sheaf during Passover. So the first meaning for the festival of Pentecost was a harvest festival. It was a day where they would offer up the first fruits of the spring harvest to God in thanksgiving, right? And because it was a great harvest festival, it was a pilgrimage festival as well. The law in the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy, required that every single adult male would come to Jerusalem, it says this in Deuteronomy 16, and that they would keep not just the feast of Passover every year, but that 50 days later they would celebrate the feast of Pentecost, which in Hebrew, by the way, was not called Pentecost. It was called the feast of Shavuot, which means the feast of weeks. In other words, the 7 sevens. So it was the feast of sevens. So 7 times 7 is 49. So 7 weeks after Passover, then on the 50th day, they would keep this great harvest festival, and they would bring bread and they would offer it up to God in the temple along with other sacrifices. So it was a harvest festival, it was a spring festival, and it was also, and this is really important, in Jewish tradition, it also became a festival of remembrance. It was a memorial feast where the Jews would celebrate the giving of the law to Israel at Mount Sinai, right? So in Jewish tradition, Passover celebrated the deliverance of Israel from Egypt on the night of the Passover with the angel of death. And Pentecost, 50 days later, celebrated the arrival of the Israelites at Mount Sinai in the desert and the reception of the law, the 10 Commandments, on Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus, chapters 19 and 20. So that's what Jews were doing. If it's Pentecost Day, everybody's in Jerusalem to offer up the spring harvest, but they're also there to remember the descent of God upon Mount Sinai and the giving of the law in the book of Exodus. Okay, so with that in mind, we can now answer the second question. Why does the Holy Spirit descend upon the apostles in tongues as of fire? Well, the answer is really simple. If you go back to the book of Exodus, chapter 19, it says this about the day that the Jews remembered on Pentecost. In Exodus 19, verse 18, it's describing God coming down upon Mount Sinai to give the Israelites the law. And in verse 18 it says, quote, Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. And the smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. So there we have it. Just as in the Old Testament, the Lord came down from heaven and descended upon Israel in fire to give them the old law, so now too, in the New Testament, on Pentecost, the Holy Spirit descends upon the apostles in tongues as of fire, not to give them the old law, which was written on tablets of stone, but to give them the new law, which is written on the tablets of their hearts. He's now going to put his law within them through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. So this is a very important point because it shows us two things. First, that Pentecost is like a new Mount Sinai, but secondly, also that the Holy Spirit is divine. It shows the divinity of the Holy Spirit. Because in the Old Testament, it was the Lord, Yahweh was the Hebrew name for God, the Lord who descended upon Mount Sinai in fire. And so now it's the Spirit who descends upon the apostles in fire at the Feast of Pentecost.